Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. This is not a fast story, and it's not meant to be. It's about land no one wanted, money that was never claimed, and a choice that came due decades later. If you're drawn to stories where the past refuses to stay buried, where ordinary people are forced to decide what kind of person they want to be, you're in the right place. Subscribe to the channel to follow stories like this one and to make sure you don't miss what comes next. If you enjoy this story, share it with someone who appreciates quiet tension, real consequences, and narratives that unfold slowly and honestly. Now let's begin. The death of Madeleine Rowe's mother did not arrive with drama. It came quietly, wrapped in hospital paperwork, muted phone calls, and the dull logistics of arranging a funeral that felt strangely impersonal for someone who had been the central constant of her life. In the days that followed, Madeleine moved through familiar motions as if she were watching herself from a distance. She signed forms, thanked people, accepted condolences she did not yet understand how to carry. What remained after the last visitor left and the house fell silent was not grief in the way she had expected it, but a persistent sense that something had been left unfinished, as if a door had been closed too quickly, leaving something important on the other side. Her mother had not spoken much in the final weeks. Medication dulled the edges of thought, turning conversations into fragments that floated in and out of coherence. But one fragment lodged itself in Madeleine's mind with stubborn clarity. In the early hours of a sleepless night, her mother had mentioned a place she had not spoken of in decades. It was a farm, somewhere in eastern Oregon, described not as home or property, but as an unresolved matter, something that should have been dealt with long ago. She had not explained further. By morning, she no longer remembered saying it at all. Madeleine tried at first to dismiss the memory as the product of exhaustion and grief. She had practical concerns that demanded attention. She was 27 years old, working contract jobs that never quite turned into stability, carrying student debt that grew heavier every year, and living in a rented apartment that felt increasingly temporary. Her mother's passing had left no inheritance beyond personal belongings and a modest life insurance policy that barely covered medical expenses. The future, which had already felt uncertain, now stretched ahead of her like an unmarked road. Yet the image of that forgotten farm refused to fade. It surfaced while she washed dishes, while she lay awake at night, while she sorted through old papers and photographs in her mother's house. The more she tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to insist on being acknowledged. Eventually, curiosity overcame reluctance. She began to search public records, expecting little, and prepared to find nothing at all. What she found instead was an upcoming county auction listing a parcel of land that matched the vague details her mother had given. The description was blunt and uninviting: a former agricultural property, long delinquent on taxes, with structures deemed unsafe and utilities disconnected decades earlier. No current occupants, no known liens beyond municipal claims. The minimum bid was symbolic, set low to encourage any interest at all. Madeleine stared at the listing longer than was reasonable. She told herself she was only gathering information, only satisfying a question that would otherwise linger unanswered. But when the day of the auction arrived, she found herself there, seated among a scattering of people who looked far more prepared than she felt. They spoke in low tones, checked their phones, and evaluated listings with practiced detachment. To them, the properties were numbers and potential returns. To Madeleine, this one listing had already become something else entirely. The bidding moved quickly, with parcels claimed and dismissed in rapid succession. When the lot number corresponding to the Eastern Oregon farm was announced, the room felt noticeably quieter. A few people glanced at the description, then looked away. No one raised a hand. The auctioneer repeated the opening bid, his voice echoing faintly in the utilitarian space. Before Madeleine had fully decided to act, her hand lifted. The motion felt automatic, almost reflexive, as if something deeper than conscious thought had taken over. There were no competing bids. The hammer fell, and just like that, ownership transferred. The amount she paid barely registered as a financial transaction. What lingered instead was the weight of what she had done. She signed documents she only partially understood, listened to warnings delivered in a tone that suggested regret on her behalf, and accepted a thin folder of papers that represented a responsibility she had not planned for. Officials made a point of ensuring she understood the condition of what she had purchased. The structures were unsafe, the land undeveloped, the history complicated. There were no guarantees, no protections, no assurances that the property could ever be made useful. Madeline listened, nodded, and signed anyway. At 27, she had already learned that certainty was rarely offered and almost never free. The decision to travel to the property came quickly. There was no practical reason to delay. If she was going to confront the consequences of her impulsive purchase, she wanted to do it on her own terms. She packed lightly, unsure of what she might need or how long she would stay. The drive took her through long stretches of open land, towns that felt suspended between past and present, and roads that seemed to narrow the farther she went. As she left the last recognizable town behind, a sense of isolation settled in. Cell service weakened and then disappeared altogether. The landscape flattened into wide open distances, broken only by fences and the occasional abandoned structure. The sky felt enormous, pressing down and opening up at the same time. It was the kind of place where thoughts grew louder simply because there was nothing to drown them out. When she finally reached the property, there was no sign to announce it, no clear boundary to mark where it began or ended. The road narrowed into a dirt track, rutted and uneven, leading to a cluster of buildings that looked as though they had been left behind by time itself. The main house sagged visibly, its windows dark and unwelcoming. Other structures stood scattered across the land, leaning at angles that suggested years of neglect rather than recent abandonment. Madeline parked and stepped out, the silence immediately noticeable. There were no sounds of activity, no nearby traffic, no indication that anyone else had reason to be here. The air carried the faint smell of dry earth and old wood. She walked slowly, taking in details she had not been prepared for. The place felt less like a property and more like a paused moment, held in place by neglect rather than memory. As she moved farther onto the land, one structure drew her attention more than the others. It was an old metal-sided building, larger and sturdier than the rest, positioned slightly apart from the house. Unlike the other buildings, it showed signs of more recent maintenance. The doors were closed, the exterior less degraded. It did not look lived in, but it did not look entirely forgotten either. The realization unsettled her. According to official records, the property had been unused for decades. Yet this building suggested otherwise, or at least hinted that someone had cared enough to keep it intact. Madeline circled it, noting subtle irregularities in the ground, marks that could not easily be explained by weather alone. The sense that she was missing something grew stronger with each step. Despite her unease, she felt drawn to stay. There was nowhere else to go, and leaving without understanding what she had bought felt like repeating a pattern she did not want to inherit. She returned to her car as the light began to shift, the sun lowering toward the horizon. The land changed character as shadows lengthened, emphasizing distance and quiet. That night, Madeline slept in her car. The seat reclined as far as it would go. A thin blanket pulled around her shoulders. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by unfamiliar sounds and the persistent awareness of how alone she was. Each time she woke, she looked toward the dark outline of the buildings, feeling both foolish and compelled to remain. By morning, the uncertainty that had accompanied her arrival had transformed into resolve. Whatever this place represented in her mother's past, whatever unfinished business had been left behind, she intended to understand it. The purchase may have made no sense on paper, but it had placed her here, on land that felt heavy with unspoken history. And Madeline sensed, with a certainty she could not yet justify, that the answers she had not known she was seeking were not in the house or the paperwork she had signed, but somewhere deeper, waiting beneath the surface of what appeared abandoned. Morning arrived slowly over the eastern Oregon plain, not with drama, but with a gradual thinning of darkness. Madeline woke stiff and unrested, the remnants of uneasy dreams clinging to her as she sat up in the car. The land looked different in daylight, less ominous but no less abandoned. Distance revealed itself more honestly, showing how far removed this place was from anything resembling help or comfort. The silence of the night had softened into a low, constant stillness, broken only by the wind moving through dry grass and the faint creak of aging structures settling under their own weight. She stepped out of the car and stretched, feeling the ground beneath her boots as something solid and indifferent. Whatever unease she had felt the night before had not disappeared, but it had shifted. It was no longer fear so much as a steady awareness that she was standing at the edge of something she did not yet understand. The sense of unfinished business she had carried since her mother's death felt more present here, as if the land itself were amplifying it. Madeline began by walking the property with deliberate care. She was not searching for anything specific at first, only trying to build a mental map of the place she now owned. The condemned house confirmed what the county had warned her about. The structure leaned inward, roof lines warped, boards softened by years of exposure. It was unsafe even to approach too closely, let alone enter. She accepted this quickly and without regret. Whatever answers she had come for were not waiting inside those walls. Her attention returned again and again to the metal-sided building she had noticed the day before. In daylight, its condition stood out even more clearly. The siding bore rust and dents, but it remained intact. The doors were heavy, reinforced, and closed with a seriousness that felt intentional. The ground around it was compacted in places, as though vehicles or equipment had once been parked there repeatedly. This was not the casual neglect of a forgotten shed. This was preservation by omission. She circled the structure slowly, letting her observations accumulate. Near one corner, the earth sloped in a way that did not match the rest of the terrain. The slope was subtle, but it caught her attention because it felt deliberate. She knelt and pressed her hand into the dirt. Beneath the surface layer of dust and gravel, the ground was firm, more so than she expected. Madeline had not come prepared for excavation, but she had brought a small toolkit, inherited from years of self-reliance rather than any specific plan. Using a pry bar and a folding shovel, she began to clear away debris near the uneven section of floor inside the building. The air inside was stale but dry, carrying the scent of metal and time. Light filtered through gaps in the siding, illuminating motes of dust that seemed to hang suspended. It took hours of slow work before the shape beneath the dirt revealed itself, a rectangular outline, edges too straight to be natural. Concrete. The surface was smooth where exposed, unmarred by cracks or weathering. The contrast between this slab and the decaying structure around it was striking. Everything else in the building showed the wear of decades. This did not. Her pulse quickened as she cleared more of the surrounding area. The slab was not large, but it was precise, poured with care and purpose. There were no obvious markings, no handles or hinges, just a seamless surface embedded into the floor. Madeleine sat back on her heels, trying to think through what she was seeing. This was not the sort of thing someone poured casually. It was meant to conceal, to protect, to last. The decision to open it did not come immediately. She spent time simply sitting there, listening to the quiet hum of the land outside, weighing her options. She could leave it untouched, report it, or walk away entirely. But the same instinct that had driven her hand up at the auction now pressed forward. If her mother had left this place unresolved, if something had been deliberately hidden here, then ignoring it would only deepen the sense of unfinished business that had followed her this far. Breaking through the concrete was not easy. The slab resisted each blow, reinforced far beyond what was necessary for a simple floor. The effort demanded patience and persistence, both of which Madeline found she had more of than she realized. Sweat and dust blurred the passage of time. Her muscles ached, her hands trembled with exertion, but eventually a fracture appeared. Then another. The sound of breaking concrete echoed sharply in the enclosed space, startling in its finality. When a section finally gave way, the air that rose from beneath carried a smell unlike anything she had expected. It was not the musty scent of rot or dampness, but something preserved, chemical, mixed with earth and metal. Madeline stepped back instinctively, heart pounding, before leaning forward again to peer into the opening. What she saw was not empty space but order. Beneath the slab lay a recessed chamber lined with protective material, carefully sealed against moisture. Inside were containers arranged with meticulous care, metal cases, sealed boxes, and stacks wrapped in protective layers. This was not a forgotten cache or a careless stash. This was storage designed to endure. With trembling hands, she lifted the first container free. It was heavier than it looked, solid in a way that spoke of value even before it was opened. Inside were documents, old but well-preserved, their edges crisp, ink still dark. Financial instruments she recognized vaguely, savings bonds and certificates bearing dates from decades earlier. Beneath them, wrapped in dense cloth, were compact bars of gold, stamped and numbered, their weight undeniable. The magnitude of the discovery did not register all at once. Madeline moved slowly, methodically, removing items and laying them out on the concrete floor. There was too much here for impulse, too much intention behind the arrangement. As she worked, she found a leather-bound notebook tucked into one corner of the chamber. Its cover was worn smooth by handling, initials pressed faintly into the surface. Harold Kincaid. She opened the notebook carefully, aware of how easily fragile things could be damaged by haste. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, dates carefully recorded, entries written with a precision that suggested habit and discipline. This was not a diary of thoughts or feelings. It was a record. Names, amounts, locations. Transactions documented with the seriousness of someone who understood the importance of accuracy. Madeline sat back, the notebook resting in her lap, and felt the weight of what she had uncovered begin to settle. This was not abandoned wealth. It was not a forgotten fortune waiting for a lucky finder. It was evidence. Evidence of intention, of trust, of a system built quietly and then interrupted. She resisted the urge to read everything at once. Instead, she closed the notebook and gathered the items back into their containers. Whatever this was, it demanded understanding before action. She covered the opening temporarily, shielding it from view, and sat alone in the building as the afternoon light shifted. By the time the sun dipped toward the horizon again, Madeline had made one decision clear to herself. She would not speak of this to anyone yet. Not the county, not acquaintances, not strangers who might see opportunity where she saw complication. Until she understood why this had been hidden and who it had been meant for, silence felt like the only responsible choice. As evening settled over the land, she returned to her car, carrying with her the knowledge that the property she had purchased on impulse was far more than an abandoned farm. Beneath its surface lay a story that had been deliberately buried, waiting not just to be found, but to be understood. And Madeline sensed that the deeper she went, the more the past would demand from her, drawing her forward into a history she could no longer pretend was not her own. The night after Madeline uncovered what lay beneath the concrete slab passed without real sleep. She remained inside the metal building long after darkness settled over the land, sitting on a folded blanket beside the hidden chamber, listening to the slow sounds of the structure cooling as the temperature dropped. The wind moved across the plains with steady persistence, brushing against the walls and slipping through seams that had widened over decades. Each sound felt amplified, not because it was threatening, but because her awareness had sharpened. The discovery beneath her feet had changed the way she experienced the space around her. The property was no longer silent. It felt watchful. When morning came, she approached the day differently than she had before. Curiosity alone was no longer enough. What she had found demanded context, explanation, and restraint. Madeline prepared coffee on a small camp stove beside her car, the simple routine grounding her as she gathered her thoughts. The notebook bearing Harold Kincaid's name sat nearby, wrapped carefully in a canvas bag. She had resisted opening it again the night before, knowing that fatigue and emotion were poor companions for understanding something so deliberate. She returned to the building once the light was strong enough to illuminate its interior clearly. Dust hung in the air, stirred by her movements, but the chamber beneath the slab remained undisturbed. Madeline retrieved the notebook and sat on an overturned crate, placing it on her knees. She opened to the first page and began to read slowly, not skimming, not jumping ahead, but letting the story unfold in the order it had been written. The earliest entries dated back more than 40 years. They described a time marked by uncertainty, economic anxiety, and distrust of institutions that had failed people too often. Kincaid wrote not as a criminal or a schemer, but as someone who believed he was providing an alternative. He recorded meetings with small business owners, farmers, and tradespeople who feared losing what little stability they had managed to build. They brought cash, not because they sought secrecy, but because they sought control. Banks felt distant and unreliable. Tangible assets felt safer. As Madeline read, a system emerged. Kincaid acted as an informal trustee, converting deposits into savings bonds, precious metals, and secure holdings that could weather inflation and political instability. He tracked everything meticulously. Names were written clearly. Amounts were exact. Dates were precise. There was no sign of carelessness or deception in the records themselves. Each entry ended with a notation confirming where the assets were stored and under what conditions they were to be returned. What unsettled Madeline most was the familiarity of certain names and annotations. As she progressed through the notebook, references began to appear that tied directly to her own family. Her mother's name surfaced in the margins, at first as an assistant, later as a trusted record keeper. She had verified transactions, organized documentation, and maintained correspondence. There were notes acknowledging her diligence and caution. Nowhere did Kincaid describe her as complicit in wrongdoing. Instead, she appeared as someone who understood the risks and worked to minimize them. The entries grew more tense as the dates advanced. External pressure began to intrude on the careful order Kincaid had constructed. He wrote of creditors who demanded early repayment, of men who framed threats as business negotiations, of fear creeping into decisions that had once felt measured. Madeline could feel the shift in tone, the tightening of language. What had started as a methodical record became something closer to a contingency plan. The farm, she learned, had been chosen deliberately. Its isolation was not incidental. The metal building had been reinforced quietly without drawing attention, and the chamber beneath the slab constructed to protect what could not be moved quickly. Kincaid described his intention to wait out the pressure, to return the assets once conditions stabilized. He wrote of deadlines he set for himself, of dates he hoped would mark a return to normalcy. Those dates passed without resolution. The final entries were brief and fragmented. Kincaid recorded visits from men whose names appeared nowhere else in the notebook, men associated with aggressive lending practices and informal enforcement. He wrote of feeling watched, of no longer trusting familiar routines. In one of the last entries, he acknowledged that his presence had become a liability. The safest place for the assets was no longer under his control. He expressed confidence that the records would outlast him, that someone with enough patience and integrity would eventually find them. The notebook ended without explanation. There was no account of departure, no acknowledgement of what followed, just a final notation, underscored twice, reminding whoever read it that the assets were never his alone. Madeline closed the notebook and sat still for a long time. The weight of inheritance pressed down on her, not in the form of wealth, but responsibility. Her mother's silence, which had once felt like emotional distance, now appeared in a different light. Leaving this place behind had not been abandonment. It had been retreat, a deliberate withdrawal from something unfinished and dangerous. She spent the rest of the day organizing what she had found. She photographed documents, cataloged contents, and cross-referenced names against public records where possible. Some names appeared easily, attached to obituaries and archive notices. Others required deeper searching. Each connection confirmed what the notebook suggested. These were real people, real families, real losses that had never been resolved. The internal conflict she had tried to avoid grew sharper with every confirmation. Legally, she suspected the situation would be complicated. Morally, it felt painfully clear. The assets beneath the farm floor did not belong to her in any meaningful sense. They represented trust placed decades earlier, trust that had been broken not by theft, but by fear and disappearance. As the sun began to set once more, Madeline stood outside the metal building and looked across the land. The distance no longer felt empty. It felt crowded with invisible presence, with the weight of decisions made long before she was born. She understood now that her purchase had not been accidental in the way she had first believed. It had placed her at the intersection of unfinished intentions and unresolved consequences. That evening, she packed the most sensitive documents and secured them out of sight. She covered the chamber again carefully, restoring the floor as much as possible. The secrecy she maintained was no longer about self-protection alone. It was about preventing interference before she understood the full scope of what needed to be done. As darkness settled, Madeline acknowledged a truth she could no longer ignore. The story buried beneath the farm was not hers to keep, but it was hers to confront. Whatever path she chose next would expose her to scrutiny, risk, and loss. Yet doing nothing would be its own form of decision, one she was not prepared to make. The history she had uncovered demanded resolution, and with that realization, Madeline crossed an invisible threshold. She was no longer merely the owner of abandoned land. She was the custodian of a story that had waited decades to be finished. By the time Madeline left the property and drove back toward the nearest town with reliable service, the decision she had been circling for days had solidified into something steadier. It was no longer a question of whether she would act, but how. The story she had uncovered beneath the concrete floor had grown too large to remain contained by silence. Every mile she put between herself and the farm felt like a narrowing corridor, guiding her toward exposure, scrutiny, and consequences she could no longer pretend were optional. She began where caution and reason suggested she must. The documents she carried were too complex, too legally fraught for improvisation. Madeline sought out an attorney whose practice focused on estates, trusts, and long-dormant financial claims, someone accustomed to cases where time had blurred responsibility and intent. The office she eventually found was unremarkable, occupying the second floor of a building that housed several small businesses, its waiting room furnished with chairs that had seen better decades. The modesty of the setting reassured her more than any polished display would have. It suggested a familiarity with work that did not resolve neatly. The attorney reviewed the materials with care that bordered on reverence. Page by page, she explained the implications Madeline had already begun to suspect. The assets, though physically in Madeline's possession, were not hers in the way property usually was. Their legal status hovered in uncertain territory, shaped by intent, documentation, and the passage of time. The existence of detailed records strengthened the case that these holdings had been maintained in trust, even if informally. But the same records also invited claims from creditors, heirs, and the state itself. Madeline listened without interruption, absorbing the reality that had been building since her discovery. Any attempt to distribute the assets properly would require public filing. Once initiated, the process could not be quietly reversed. Notices would be issued. Names would surface. Interests long dormant would awaken. She would be questioned, examined, and possibly accused of motives she did not have. Leaving the office, Madeline felt neither relieved nor discouraged. The clarity had a sobering effect, but it also affirmed what she already knew. There was no version of this story that allowed her to remain untouched. The choice lay between active responsibility and passive complicity. As filings were prepared, the ripple effects began sooner than she expected. Public records have a way of traveling quickly, especially in places where history lingers close to the surface. Within weeks, inquiries arrived from state agencies seeking clarification on the nature of the assets. Financial institutions requested verification. Archivists and clerks resurfaced documents long thought irrelevant. Each contact brought with it another reminder that the past does not remain buried once it is disturbed. More difficult were the human connections. Madeline began the process of reaching out to the families named in Harold Kincaid's records. Some addresses led to empty houses or businesses long closed. Others connected her to people who had lived their entire adult lives without resolution, carrying loss as a quiet companion. The responses varied widely. Skepticism was common. Anger was frequent. Hope appeared cautiously, often only after repeated confirmation that this was not a cruel misunderstanding or a belated scam. In each case, Madeline provided documentation rather than promises. She resisted the impulse to reassure beyond what could be proven. The weight of expectation pressed against her, and she learned quickly how fragile trust could be after decades of absence. Still, persistence yielded results. Families who had once believed their losses were forgotten began to reassemble records of their own, piecing together fragments of a financial past that had shaped their present more than they realized. The process might have continued this way, difficult but manageable, had it not attracted another kind of attention. A formal claim arrived asserting priority over the assets, filed on behalf of an estate connected to one of Kincaid's most aggressive creditors. The claim was precise, supported by contracts and liens that predated the concealment of the assets. It reframed the narrative not as one of trust interrupted, but of debt unpaid. The arrival of this claim changed everything. What had been a morally driven effort now carried the full weight of adversarial scrutiny. The creditors' representatives questioned not only the distribution plan, but Madeline's role itself. They argued that the assets, regardless of intent, had served as collateral and therefore belonged to the estate seeking repayment. The language of the filings was measured, professional, and unmistakably dismissive of the human consequences Madeline had begun to confront. Pressure mounted from multiple directions. Advisors cautioned her to reconsider the scope of her involvement. The financial reality was impossible to ignore. The costs of litigation, administration, and verification accumulated steadily. Each step forward narrowed her margin for retreat. There were moments when the simplest path appeared almost seductive. She could negotiate a settlement, retain a portion of the assets, and walk away with her future secured. The law would not necessarily condemn such a choice, but each time she considered it, Madeline returned to the notebook, to the meticulous handwriting that had preserved intention against time. The people named there had entrusted their savings to a system built on faith, not enforcement. To abandon them now would not undo the past, but it would repeat its most damaging pattern. As proceedings advanced, Madeline committed fully to transparency. She authorized the release of documentation, cooperated with inquiries, and accepted the scrutiny that followed. Her resolve did not go unnoticed. Some families, initially hesitant, became vocal in their support, submitting statements that detailed the losses endured and the long uncertainty that followed. Their testimonies transformed abstract sums into lived consequences. The mounting conflict demanded a formal resolution. A hearing was scheduled, consolidating claims into a single proceeding that would determine the fate of the assets. The date marked a boundary Madeline could feel approaching, a point beyond which the story would no longer belong to her alone. In the weeks leading up to it, she returned often to the farm. The land provided a strange comfort, its silence unchanged despite the upheaval it had unleashed. Standing near the metal building, she felt the continuity of place more sharply than ever. The structures bore witness without judgment, reminders that time absorbs action and inaction alike. On the eve of the hearing, Madeline understood that whatever the outcome, her role had already reshaped the story. The past had demanded recognition, and she had answered. Whether that answer would satisfy law, morality, or neither remained uncertain. But the act of engagement itself had broken the long silence that had allowed fear and loss to define the narrative for so long. As she prepared to face the final scrutiny, Madeline accepted a truth that had become unavoidable. The cost of doing what felt right would not be measured only in money. It would be measured in endurance, in exposure, and in the willingness to be changed by a history she had never intended to inherit. The past, once unearthed, had claimed her attention fully, and it would not be denied resolution. The morning of the hearing arrived without ceremony, as if indifferent to the weight it carried for everyone involved. Madeline noticed this as she prepared to leave the small rented room she had taken near the courthouse. The light outside was ordinary, the streets already active with people moving through routines untouched by the consequences about to be decided. That ordinariness steadied her more than she expected. It reminded her that whatever happened, life would continue, shaped but not halted by the outcome. Inside the courthouse, time seemed to compress. The room where the case was heard carried the faint smell of old wood and paper, an atmosphere built from decades of disputes resolved and unresolved. Madeline took her place among the assembled parties, aware of the families seated nearby, of the representatives of the creditor estate reviewing documents with practiced detachment, of the attorneys who had learned to mask anticipation behind professionalism. She felt exposed, not because she doubted her choice, but because the choice itself was no longer private. The proceedings unfolded slowly, methodically. Evidence was presented, reviewed, and contextualized. The documentation Harold Kincaid had preserved proved as significant as Madeline had believed it would be. Its clarity cut through decades of uncertainty, establishing not only the existence of the assets, but the intent behind their accumulation and concealment. Expert testimony explained how informal trusts, though fragile, could survive time when supported by consistent records and corroborating accounts. The opposing claim was equally thorough. Contracts and liens were introduced, demonstrating that the debt owed to the creditor predated the concealment and had never been formally discharged. The law, in its strictest reading, favored priority of repayment. Madeline listened as arguments circled the same facts from opposing angles, each side framing justice differently. One emphasized obligation to contracts, the other emphasized obligation to people. When the court addressed Madeline directly, the attention felt heavier than she had anticipated. Her role, though unplanned, had become central. She explained her discovery, her research, and her reasoning without embellishment. She described the choice she had faced and the one she had made. She spoke not as an expert or an advocate, but as a custodian of something that did not belong to her. In that moment, she understood that credibility came not from confidence alone, but from consistency between words and action. The ruling did not arrive immediately. The judge recessed, taking time to review materials and arguments. The pause stretched long enough to feel uncomfortable. When the court reconvened, the room settled into a silence shaped by expectation. The decision, when delivered, acknowledged complexity rather than denying it. The court recognized the legitimacy of the creditor's claim and ordered compensation equal to the original debt, adjusted for reasonable interest rather than punitive accumulation. At the same time, it affirmed the trust intent documented in Kincaid's records. The remaining assets, after repayment and costs, were designated for distribution among the verified families of the original contributors, proportional to their recorded investments. The ruling satisfied no one completely and yet felt unmistakably fair. Madeline felt a release she had not realized she was holding back. The outcome validated neither greed nor fear, but responsibility. It honored contracts without erasing the human costs they had imposed. As the room gradually emptied, families exchanged quiet acknowledgments, some relieved, some still processing what decades of loss could never fully restore. The months that followed were consumed by administration rather than drama. Bonds were liquidated under supervision, gold assessed and sold through official channels, funds allocated and transferred. Madeline remained involved throughout, signing documents, answering questions, ensuring that the process remained transparent. The sums each family received varied, but the impact was tangible. For some, the funds resolved long-standing debts. For others, they provided opportunities once denied. No amount could rewrite history, but it could alter what came next. Letters began to arrive once distributions were complete. They were not uniform in tone. Some expressed gratitude. Others conveyed regret that resolution had come too late to change certain outcomes. A few questioned whether the effort had been worth the cost. Madeline read each one carefully, understanding that none of these reactions invalidated the choice she had made. They were part of the legacy she had accepted. When the legal work finally concluded, Madeline returned to the farm with a sense of quiet finality. The land felt different, though nothing visible had changed. The metal building still stood, its walls unchanged, the repaired floor marking where the chamber had once been accessed. On advice from her attorney, she left the patch visible rather than concealing it completely. It served as a reminder, not of treasure, but of responsibility uncovered. Financially, Madeline's outcome was modest. After costs and distributions, what remained was enough to settle her mother's outstanding obligations and invest cautiously in restoring parts of the property. She began with the practical tasks, reinforcing structures, repairing fences, securing access roads. The condemned house remained untouched, a project for another time or perhaps never. She did not see the land as an enterprise to exploit. It was instead a place to inhabit thoughtfully. As seasons changed, the farm became less a site of revelation and more a space of continuity. Madeline spent time there not to escape the world, but to engage with it on terms that felt earned. She learned the boundaries of the property, not just on maps, but in practice. She learned the patterns of weather and silence. She learned what it meant to live with history without being consumed by it. The concrete slab, once a barrier, became a marker. It reminded her that some things remain hidden until someone is willing to face the consequences of uncovering them. It reminded her that inheritance is not always about what is given, but about what is confronted. In time, Madeline understood that the true legacy of her choice was not measured by financial outcomes or public acknowledgement. It was measured by the way the story ended differently than it had begun. Where fear and disappearance once defined the narrative, resolution and accountability now stood in their place. Standing on the land at dusk, watching light recede across the open distance, Madeline felt a sense of completion that was not triumphant, but grounded. She had not corrected the past, but she had refused to repeat it. In doing so, she had built something quieter and more durable than wealth. She had built a way forward that allowed both memory and responsibility to coexist. The farm no longer felt abandoned. It felt settled, not because its history had been erased, but because it had finally been acknowledged. And in that acknowledgement, Madeline found not an ending, but a beginning shaped by choice rather than chance, by intention rather than avoidance. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about the choices people make when no one is watching, then you're exactly the kind of listener this channel is for. Subscribe to stay with these stories as they continue, because there are more buried histories, more unfinished decisions, and more quiet moments where the past reaches into the present. Watch the next video to see where this journey leads, or explore the other stories on the channel. Each one stands on its own, but together they ask the same question. What do we do when we're given a chance to finish something that was left behind? And if this story meant something to you, share it. Stories like this don't travel fast on their own. They move because someone decides they're worth passing on. Thank you for listening. The next story is already waiting.